It had taken a week to get the keys to their cell from that dog. That had been the easy part. Abner Pintel crouched in the shadows and listened. He heard footsteps around the corner, the sharp, leathery clip-clop of naval boots on stone that he'd grown sickeningly familiar with over the course of that week. There were 2 sets of them, made all the more clear by the twin shadows creeping up the stone wall at the end of the hallway, and they were steadily growing louder as the pair of night guards they belonged to drew near. Those footsteps had already grown to mean death to Pintel. He'd heard them the first morning of his imprisonment in Port Royal, when the guards had come around this very corner to fetch Jack Sparrow for the noose. And Twig the morning after. Then Scratch. Then Simbaka. Then Hawksmoor and Dog-Ear and Ketchum. Every sunrise had brought the sound of those footsteps to this dim, dank hall, where he and his crewmates sat caged in their cells, and each time he'd gone still as a statue and been forced to watch in dread as those guards had made their selection and hauled one more pirate off to his death. Some of his crewmates had gone willingly, in somber or shocked silence. Others had been dragged away in wide-eyed terror, throwing futile glances back at their cellmates for help. Jack Sparrow had been the only prisoner to escape his fate. Until tonight. Pintel gritted his teeth and counted the approaching steps. He almost had to strain to hear them over the sound of his own heart pounding, but experience had made his timing impeccable. As soon as the 2 red-coated figures turned left at that corner and entered his view, the old sea rat struck. The first guard took a wooden bench square to the face and collapsed. The second doubled over from a knee to his groin, and then collapsed when that same bench struck the back of his head. Pintel set down his makeshift weapon as quietly as possible and knelt with a grunt beside the unconscious men. He grimaced at them, or rather at how much taller and slimmer than himself they both were. Then he tugged at one of the nearest guard's boots. Getting out of their cell had been the easy part of his plan. The hard part would be getting out of the fort, especially in a disguise that wasn't going to fit him.
"Rags,"
he hissed over his shoulder.
"Give me a hand with this, will ya?"
Instead of a reply, he heard the creak of iron hinges behind him. Pintel whirled around and froze with bulging eyes. He could see his cellmate Ragetti farther down the corridor of cages, clutching the keys with their hairy little keeper beside him, but the view was obstructed by the bars of 6 cell doors. They had all been opened, and not by any of the pirates still sleeping inside. Ragetti threw Pintel a quick glance, then stooped with the keys in front of the last cell in the row.
"What the blazes are you doing?"
The older jailbird nearly squeaked in alarm. "Hoy, they deserves a chance same as us," Ragetti muttered back defensively.
"We earned our chance. Now forget the lot of them and help me with these uniforms before you blows our cover."
The younger man faced him directly and stood up straight. Even through that jungle of bars, Pintel could see a scowl twist those thin lips, right before Ragetti jammed a key into the last door's lock anyway. In seconds, he had that door wide open just like all the others. Pintel clenched his jaw angrily. A week ago, he might have abandoned his work and stormed right up to that defiant little git to teach him a lesson. But he thought better of it now. Even if he didn't, a sudden wave of terror kept him rooted in place when he saw who occupied that last cell. Awake or asleep, the hulking figure of Bosun still looked 100 times more menacing than any approaching guard's shadow. Thank goodness the big brute was asleep for now, though. Ragetti shoved past the prison dog, keeping his hold on the keys, and finally trudged up to Pintel. He didn't wake any of their newly freed crewmates along the way, but the looks he spared them with his one remaining eye showed he was considering it. His older comrade kept him on track with a harsh wave, and the duo hunched over the guards together. For all his haste, Pintel still managed to notice the thick leather-bound book tucked almost sneakily under one of his friend's arms. He shot at a knowing sneer. If the Navy didn't kill him someday, those bloody missionaries would.
"The breeches is too short."
"They looks fine." They doesn't come down all the way to the stockings. It's against regulation. They looks for things like that.
Well, at least you can close your shirt in the front. No one's gonna get close enough to get a good look at us, Rags. Now, if you got all our stuff..."
The taller man held up a long, thoroughly stuffed bundle wrapped in a sheet of white canvas. He'd threaded the strap of Pintel's own sword baldric through it so it could be worn across the chest from shoulder to hip. Threw in a few of Twig and Scratchy's weapons, too," Ragetti murmured. "Figured they'd want us to have 'em."
"Aye," Pintel said sourly. "Real brothers of charity they was. Give it here."
He took the bundle from Ragetti and strapped it over his bare chest. Hopefully that would look closer to regulation from a distance.
"Come on."
Ring of keys in hand, the pair exited the storeroom of confiscated items and hurried down the next corridor. They were in the fort's armory 1 level above the prison, dressed head to toe in their stolen naval uniforms, with a musket in each of their grasps. If Pintel's recollection was correct from when the soldiers had first brought them in, he and Ragetti only had one corner to round until they'd reached the exit onto the observation parapet. From there, freedom would just be one march down the exterior steps and across the beach to the shore. He felt a bony finger tap the back of his bald head just then.
"You still has to put on the wig,"
Ragetti whispered. Pintel pushed his black tricorner hat tighter down onto his scalp.
"No, I doesn't. Lots of soldiers don't wear 'em."
"These ones do. These is second-class petty officer uniforms. Any rank higher than third-class petty officer has to wear a wig." The elder squinted back at his cohorts strangely. The wig in question hung limp as a dead seagull in Ragetti's outstretched hand, and Ragetti himself looked like an upside-down mop, with the other curly white accessory puffing out from under his own hat.
"How do you knows that?"
Pintel rasped. "How do you not knows that by now?"
"It wasn't the rule back when we..."
More footsteps around the corner stopped them in their tracks. Both men flattened themselves against the stone wall beside them. Then, working up his nerve, Pintel inched forward just enough to peer beyond its edge. A perfect square of moonlight, a wide-open doorway, greeted him at the end of the adjacent corridor. The blue-coated officer, standing just outside that doorway, was too preoccupied with something below the parapet to greet him as well. Pintel ducked back out of sight and lowered his voice.
"There's only one, but we gotta get past him."
He was about to ask for suggestions when a quiet panting sound drew his attention to the floor. There sat the prison dog, patiently waiting with its tongue lolling from its mouth and its wide brown eyes fixed on him. Pintel stared back at it, perplexed but not perturbed.
"What's he doing up here?"
"We still got his favorite chew toy," Ragetti grumbled, gesturing to the keys in his fellow escapee's hand. "He won't let it out of his sight." Pintel hesitated, oddly enough. Letting the animal tag along with him in Rags would be risky, and he supposed they didn't need the keys anymore. Then again, the furry little jailer hadn't sounded an alarm against them yet, and not any prisoner could convince it to hand over its keys the way he had. He hated to cast that hard-won card from his hand so soon. Then he got an idea. The old schemer gripped the keys tightly together so they wouldn't make noise, and held them up. The dog's gaze rose with them like it was connected by a puppet string. That made Pintel grin.
"You wants your keys back, Poochie?"
he goaded playfully. He waved the metal trinkets around a few more times to make certain the canine wouldn't waver.
"Think you can get 'em from old Pinter's?"
"What are you up to?" Ragetti asked nervously. He was looking back and forth and clutching his musket to his chest like he thought he could hide behind it. Pintel cocked a single bushy eyebrow.
"I'm just teaching the little job lover how to have some fun."
He spun away, swung his arm with the keys, and pitched the perfect curve throw around that corner into the moonlight. The keys never left his hand. The dog didn't realize that until it had run nearly all the way out to the parapet. Pintel heard it bark. Then he heard a muffled voice that had to have come from the officer outside. After that came the sound of more footsteps. He knew what to do from there. As soon as the officer rounded the corner with the dog, Pintel made the man's clean-shaven chin ring with a blow from the butt of his musket. The blue-coated figure hit the floor with a soft thud and was promptly dragged out of view by his ankles. Another grin spread across Pintel's face when he saw how much older and stouter this soldier was than the last two.
"Good boy, Poochie," he crooned as he scratched behind the dog's ears. "You're helping old Pinner's size up."
Ragetti leaned over him and frowned. Oi, that's a lieutenant. You definitely gotta wear his wig. Pintel ended up assembling a combination of the two uniforms. He put on most of the lieutenant's clothes, but he kept the red coat on over them to look more like he belonged on duty with Ragetti. And yes, he also put on one of those stupid wigs, even though his scraggly facial hair was bound to give him away faster than a lack of any fake hair would. He returned the dog's keys with a farewell pat on its head, then he marched away with Rags and finally emerged from Port Royal's prison. The moonlight made both of them flinch at first. But of course nothing happened. Their undead curse of the past 10 years had been lifted over a week ago. There were other soldiers stationed on the fort's parapet, but the two fugitives reached the exterior steps before crossing paths with any of them. Just as predicted, that led them down to the shore and across a sandy beach to the moonlit docks on the harbor. They passed a few longboats lying on the ground, but Pintel told Ragetti to leave those in place. It would take them too long to haul one to the water, and they'd look far too suspicious to all the real redcoats on the docks in the meantime. Instead, Pintel took a quick survey of the area and set off in a new direction. He unhooked a lit oil lamp from a post and calmly led the way to the end of an unguarded dock. There, stacked expertly before the cargo ship that had delivered them, sat a pyramid of barrels. Powder barrels. The rest was a no-brainer. Pintel dripped oil from the lamp onto the pyramid and laid a thin trail of it behind him as he marched with Ragetti back up the dock to the beach. When the oil lamp was just about spent, he slipped off the lamp's glass protector, exposing the flickering flame inside, and dropped it. "Duck," he told his accomplice. They hit the sand together as a searing red burst erupted from the end of the dock. Soldiers were running and shouting everywhere after that. That was all the cover the duo needed to make their getaway. Pintel grabbed Ragetti's sleeve and dragged him back in the direction they'd come. This time they passed the longboats on the ground in favor of another dock, and the massive, grand naval galleon moored to the end of it. Up the ramp, across the deck, and straight to the starboard rail the pair bolted. Plenty of longboats hung there on ropes and pulleys, ready to be lowered onto the surf. They found a set of oars, made their selection, and scrambled aboard. Pintel's feet had barely touched down on the boat's wooden floor when a third figure leapt in after them. In spite of all his urgency, the bald seafarer had to stop and gawk at the intruder. The prison dog blinked back at him with a happy wag of its tail. The pirates traded glances. Ragetti wrinkled his nose disapprovingly, but Pintel gave a good-humored shrug and went back to work. They'd sailed with worse company. They had the boat lowered in minutes. Each man took up an oar and made even shorter work of rowing away from the ship. Thick plumes of smoke marked the site of their diversion, as did the faint sounds of all the soldiers still buzzing around it to put out the flames. Pintel slowed his rowing and spared a triumphant smirk at his handiwork. That was when the piercing clang of a ship bell sounded across the water. All three renegades jumped at the noise and ogled back at their mothership. Sure enough, they spotted a single red figure on the main deck, practically bouncing up and down like a fishing bobber as it tugged the alert bell's rope. That figure had spotted them, too. Pintel went rigid with fright. What could he do now? They were sitting ducks out here. All it would take was for a few more soldiers to hurry aboard that ship and ready the starboard cannons, and then he and Rags would have nowhere else to go but straight down. He churned his oar frantically. "Keep rowing! Try to get out of range!" Ragetti didn't have to be told twice. Pintel heard the youngster's breath coming out in terrified hisses, and saw white foam splashing up on either side of them as they quickened their pace. But still that dreaded bell kept ringing. He clenched his jaw and kept his head down, trying not to listen, trying to focus on just getting away. The bell went silent. Pintel paused and raised his head. He could still see that lone redcoat up on the ship's deck, but the soldier now looked to be standing motionless. The jailbird was starting to brace himself for the worst when that soldier abruptly keeled over. The scarlet uniform dropped from sight to reveal a darker figure standing behind it. Bosun towered over the deck, armed with a snarl and a blood-stained scimitar. Pintel nodded stiffly. "I misjudged him. Good man if there ever was one." He resumed his rowing. Ragetti didn't. "Rags?" Pintel looked to his friend. He was seated on Ragetti's right side, the side that sported that lifeless wooden eye. It made the youngster's expression harder to read, but it seemed to show a mixture of horror and almost sadness. Guilt. As if Rags felt like he was the one who just gutted that redcoat. Bloody Bible. Oi. The older pirate reached over and nudged his arm lightly. It's all right now, mate. We made it. It's over. Ragetti hung his head darkly. What is? Pintel squared his jaw and tried to summon an answer. Then he gave up and quietly swept his oar again.